Revenge woven in silence, a tale of hidden wounds, frozen hearts, and a storm that concealed more than snow where love was a disguise. Betrayal ran deep, and the chill of vengeance lingered long after footprints faded, leaving behind only echoes, regret, and the quiet justice of a heart once broken. The wind screamed like a wounded creature as it descended upon the narrow, secluded valley nestled high in the northern mountains. Snow pelted down from the heavens in relentless sheets, twisting and whirling like 1,000 vengeful spirits. The villagers of the tiny mountain town, accustomed to harsh winters, stayed hidden behind shuttered windows and thick walls, watching as nature's fury clawed at their homes. This was no ordinary storm. It was a white tempest. A snowstorm unlike any in recent memory, and with it came something even more unexpected. A lone figure, shivering and soaked, appearing on the icy trail leading into town. She emerged from the storm like a shadow, barely distinguishable beneath her heavy coat and snow-laden scarf. A single suitcase dragged behind her, catching in the deep drifts with every staggering step. Her boots were caked with slush, her limbs stiff from the cold, yet she pressed forward, drawn not by destination but necessity. The town did not welcome her. Windows remained closed, curtains drawn. Doors did not open to her silent plea. She might have been a ghost to them, a specter of suffering, passing unnoticed. But one soul did see her, one man, standing alone beside his humble log cabin at the edge of the forest. He had watched the storm roll in from the west, the sky bruising over the horizon and winds stirring the ancient trees into wild dances. He had secured his livestock, chopped extra firewood, and stoked his hearth, prepared to wait it out like every winter before. But as the storm began its descent, he spotted her through the blur of white, a slight figure battling the storm, losing. Something within him, honed by solitude and softened by time, compelled him to act. Without a word, he stepped outside, braving the gale, and left the cabin door ajar behind him. She didn't speak as she entered, only stumbled across the threshold like one returning from war. Snow fell from her coat in thick clumps, and her breath came in ragged clouds. He closed the door behind her, sealing out the storm, and for a moment they simply stood in the dim light, strangers bound by circumstance. The room had plain wooden walls, a stove radiating heat, a small bed, a worn rug, and a table with only one chair. She looked around not with fear, but with the hollow eyes of someone who had stopped expecting kindness. He gestured gently for her to sit by the fire. She obeyed, shedding her coat slowly, revealing layers of clothes and a pale, drawn face framed by damp hair. Her eyes were distant but alive. He busied himself with making tea, heating water in a rusted kettle, and placing it before her without question or comment. She held the cup like a lifeline, fingers trembling, absorbing the warmth more than the flavor. That night passed with few sounds but the cracking of firewood and the moan of wind outside. The storm did not let up, and neither did the silence. She slept on the cot, curled tightly beneath thick quilts he laid out. He took the floor near the hearth, wrapped in his woolen blanket. The only light was from the fire, dancing across the log walls, casting flickering shadows that merged and separated in rhythm with the storm. The morning did not bring relief. Snow continued to fall, heavier than before, cutting off the village entirely from the world beyond. Roads disappeared. Paths became death traps. The mountains themselves seemed buried in endless white. But inside the cabin, a fragile routine began to form. She woke early, always before him, and quietly swept the floor, gathered kindling, and checked on the frost-laced windows. He cooked simple meals, stew, thick porridge, and roasted roots, and set an extra bowl without hesitation. She did not speak, but she was not silent. Her movements spoke. She poured water for him without prompting. She placed his gloves by the stove to warm. She began to knead dough from the flour in her bag, baking bread whose smell lingered long after the crust had cooled. The rhythm between them was unspoken, a harmony built not on shared language, but on mutual presence. Days passed, then weeks. The snow outside built taller walls than the cabin itself, yet inside warmth grew. She hummed sometimes, softly as she stirred soup or swept corners. The tunes were foreign, perhaps lullabies or half-remembered melodies from a distant home. He would pause his wood chopping to listen, letting the notes mix with the fire's crackle and the wind's howl, forming music only they would ever hear. She carried a ring around her neck on a thin silver chain. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she would take it in her hands and stare at it for long minutes. It was a simple thing, delicate and unadorned, but the way she held it betrayed its weight. He never asked about it. He never asked her name, nor gave his. In their silence, there was safety and understanding that stories once shared might break the fragile peace they had found. The cabin, once bare, began to show signs of her. She rearranged the shelves. She cleaned the soot-stained panes. She placed a small sprig of pine above the window, a touch of green in an ocean of white. He made no protest. In fact, each change brought a quiet satisfaction. His home was becoming more than a shelter. It was becoming lived in, alive. One day, the snow ceased, just briefly. A pale sun bled through the clouds, casting a gray light over the blanketed world. The trees stood still for the first time in weeks. They ventured outside together, bundled in heavy coats, shovels in hand, to clear the roof, the steps, and the narrow path to the shed. Side by side, they worked in rhythm, neither speaking, their breaths forming twin plumes in the frigid air. He glanced at her as she worked. She was stronger than she looked. Her expression, though quiet, bore the hardened lines of someone who had endured much. She didn't shy away from the cold or the labor. When their eyes met, something passed between them. Not recognition, but something softer, the beginning of familiarity. Inside that night, the fire burned longer. She added herbs to the stew, herbs she'd foraged from her suitcase, dried and folded into parchment. They sat at the table together, eating slowly. It was the first time he had shared a meal with another in that place since the passing of his wife many winters ago. He thought of her only in brief flashes now, her laughter in summer, her absence in spring. But tonight, her memory didn't ache, only peace. The next week brought another storm, though less fierce. They stayed indoors, confined again, but no longer strangers. She began to read a book he had left on the shelf, one about distant lands and forgotten wars. She read silently, tracing the words with her finger, occasionally glancing toward him when a passage seemed to strike her. Sometimes she handed it to him to read next. Without speaking, they passed stories back and forth like offerings. He had not laughed in years, but one afternoon, as she tried to fix the broken leg of a chair using only rope and stubbornness, something in her expression, determined and annoyed, made him chuckle aloud. She looked up, surprised, and for the first time smiled without restraint. That smile lit the cabin brighter than the fire ever had. It was fleeting, but it planted something deep within him, something that warmed even the coldest corners of his spirit. More time passed. The snow, though ever present, became part of their life rather than a barrier. They moved in a slow dance of domesticity, baking, cleaning, and tending the stove. He began carving again, shaping pieces of wood into figures. She watched him work, sometimes bringing him tea, sometimes placing a hand on his shoulder when his fingers cramped. One evening, he handed her a small carving of a bird in flight. She accepted it without words and placed it beside her bed. Spring approached in whispers. The wind softened. Icicles wept in the morning sun. Birds returned hesitantly, their songs thin but hopeful. The path down the mountain began to emerge, muddy and treacherous, but passable. She stood often at the cabin's edge now, gazing down that trail. Her suitcase remained tucked under the bed, but no longer forgotten. The ring still hung from her neck, but she touched it less. He knew the moment was coming. Her time there was never meant to last. She had been an unexpected, transforming, and ultimately fleeting winter gift. The silence between them shifted once more, no longer peaceful, but heavy with the weight of an unspoken farewell. He did not ask her to stay. He did not need to. She understood what they had shared, just as he did. It had been real, and it had mattered. One morning, as frost clung stubbornly to the ground, she began to pack. Neatly, without rush, as though she were simply tidying the space. He watched her without interference, his heart full of quiet ache. Before she left, she removed the ring from her neck and placed it in his hand. He looked at it, then at her, but she was already turning toward the door. She walked down the path alone, just as she had arrived, but the storm no longer raged. The sun filtered through the pines, and birds sang above her. Her boots sank into mud instead of snow, and her suitcase rolled easier now. She did not look back, but he did not need her to. Her presence had reshaped his world, and that would not fade. The mountains thawed slowly, begrudgingly letting go of winter's grip. The frozen silence that had once entombed the valley began to recede, revealing the faint green promise of renewal beneath. Streams that had been choked by ice now gurgled freely, cutting paths through the melting snow. The cabin, still standing stoically at the edge of the forest, remained unchanged in form but no longer in spirit. Within its wooden walls, something invisible had shifted. A season had ended, and a presence had passed through, leaving behind a quiet transformation. He remained after her departure, as he always had. There was no farewell in words, but a lingering echo in every corner of the cabin. The chair she had once mended still creaked softly when he sat in it. The small wooden bird he had carved for her rested on the windowsill, watching the forest beyond as though waiting. Her scent lingered faintly on the wool blanket, mingling with the scent of pine, smoke, and old memories. He wore the ring now not on his finger but strung on a cord around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt. It was not a token of possession, but of remembrance, not a claim, but a tribute. He never questioned the reason she left it with him. In the silent days that followed, he did not speak her name, never having asked it, but he carried her with him in every breath and every gesture. The village below resumed its rhythms with the coming of spring. Traders returned along muddy roads, bringing wares and news. Children laughed again in thawing streets, chasing one another between puddles. Yet the man in the cabin remained apart, not from disdain or sorrow, but from choice. His was a solitude no longer steeped in grief, but in peace. He kept to his habits. Each morning he rose early, tended the stove, chopped wood, and prepared breakfast. The second bowl he placed at the table remained untouched, but he continued to set it just the same. Not out of denial, but as ritual. He repaired the roof shingles that had cracked under the weight of snow. He built a small garden box and filled it with soil as the last frost passed, unsure if anything would grow. But the effort felt right, something she might have done had she stayed. Letters came from the village now and then, brought by passing travelers. He read them slowly, his eyes following the loops and lines without urgency. None were from her. He hadn't expected any. She had arrived without warning and left the same way. Hers was not a journey meant to circle back. Still, when the wind picked up through the trees carrying the sound of rustling leaves, he sometimes paused and listened, just in case the forest whispered her footsteps again. Summer in the mountains was short but vivid. The wildflowers burst forth in defiant color, covering meadows and roadsides with a brightness almost painful after the months of gray. Bees returned. The soil grew fragrant. He planted herbs, guided by memory rather than knowledge. He remembered how she had ground dried leaves into their stews, how her fingers had brushed across the edge of her suitcase when she had found them. He did not know what names they had carried, but he planted what felt familiar. When they sprouted, he considered it a sign not of her return, but of her continuing presence. He carved more frequently now. Where once his hands had shaped utilitarian objects, bowls, spoons, and handles, now they created for the sake of creating. Birds, foxes, wolves, and mountain deer emerged from blocks of cedar. He shaped a figure that resembled her not by face, which he never dared to carve, but by posture and presence. A woman standing at the edge of a forest, her head tilted slightly downward, as if in contemplation. He placed it on the mantel, where firelight cast her silhouette onto the wall each night. Seasons turned again. Autumn came with a golden hush, painting the trees in amber and fire. The wind, once fierce and punishing, now carried scents of harvest and decaying leaves. He began storing food, patching windows, and stacking firewood in preparation. The first snow fell quietly one evening as he sat by the fire, a faint dusting that covered the world like a breath. He stepped outside, letting the flakes touch his skin. For a moment, he imagined her there beside him, her footprints next to his in the fresh snow. Winter returned, as it always did, fierce, beautiful, and unrelenting. The storms that year were mild compared to the one she had arrived in, but the cold felt sharper in her absence. He found himself watching the road more often, scanning the white horizon. Each time the snow gathered thick enough to obscure the trail, he felt an old ache stir beneath his ribs. Not hope, but longing. A soft, familiar ache that no longer hurt, only pulsed like a remembered song. Then, one afternoon in the deepest part of the season, something changed. A noise outside, muffled by snow but distinct from a crunch of boots against frozen ground. He opened the door slowly, cautiously, and saw not her, but a young girl, breathless and red-cheeked, holding a letter. She said nothing, only placed the envelope into his gloved hands before turning and disappearing back down the trail, her figure swallowed by swirling flakes. He closed the door and sat by the fire. The envelope was unmarked but familiar in its weight. He opened it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was delicate, elegant in its simplicity. She wrote not of love or regret, nor did she offer explanations. She wrote of travel, of cities by the sea, of people she had met, and of the places she had slept beneath foreign skies. She mentioned a garden she had tended, the laughter of children in the village square, and how sometimes, when it snowed, she would stop and remember the cabin, the man, and the silence they had shared. She asked for nothing, gave no return address. Yet in every line there was present an acknowledgement of something sacred that had passed between them. He read the letter many times that night, each word a match struck in the dark. He placed it inside a small box, alongside the ring, the pine sprig she had hung, and the bird carving she had once held. Years passed. The man grew older. His hands, once steady and strong, began to tremble. His eyes dimmed, but his mind remained sharp, fixed to the seasons that cycled endlessly outside his window. The cabin changed around him, though he did little to alter it. Visitors came now and then, hikers caught in sudden storms, and wanderers drawn by the legend of the silent woodsman whose heart never turned away from the cold. He welcomed them all, offering food, shelter, and a chair by the fire. To those who stayed long enough, he would show the carvings, the garden, and the firewood stack, built with almost reverent care. He never spoke much. But when the snow began to fall in earnest, he would sit at the window, the ring still around his neck, the letter within reach, and watch the road. He dreamed of her often, not in sorrow or fantasy, but in quiet revisitations. Dreams where she stood in the snow, smiling faintly, her coat billowing as the wind carried them both into memory. Sometimes he saw her in the trees, in the curve of the hills, in the flight of birds rising from the garden. He no longer waited for her return. He had come to understand that some love is not meant to be held in permanence, but in preservation. One final winter arrived, gentler than most. The snow that year fell in soft blankets, muffling the world into a kind of sacred stillness. He was slower now, his breath shallower, but his eyes still watched the white expanse beyond his window with the same unspoken question. One morning, the villagers found the cabin door ajar. The fire burned low, and the man was sitting peacefully in his chair, eyes closed, the ring resting in his open palm. His expression bore no fear, only the still serenity of one who had lived a full story. They buried him beneath the largest pine near the cabin, where the snow melted first each spring and wildflowers dared to bloom even through frost. Years turned again. The cabin became a place of quiet pilgrimage. No one moved in, but many came to sit within its walls, to feel the peace it held. Travelers left tokens, small carvings, pine sprigs, and occasionally letters tucked into the corners or under the bird carving on the windowsill. And once, many winters later, a woman appeared. She arrived with snow in her hair, older now, her face lined by years and sunlight. She stepped inside without knocking, placed a single carved figure beside the fireplace, a woman standing still, gazing into the woods, and sat quietly in the chair where he once had waited. She did not speak, she did not cry. She only stayed for a while, watching the snow fall in long, slow sheets. When she left, the cabin remained as it had been. But something in the air had shifted again. Love, once seated in silence and grown in the heart of a storm, had completed its circle. And in the hush that followed, the mountains stood watch as they always had, holding the story of two souls who met amidst a snowstorm of love and never truly parted.